discussed all the parts of each of the chapters in writing a research paper. Now we will further elaborate on some of the elements on each of these chapters. Starting with chapter number 1. Again, this is the problem and the background of the study, starting with the research problem. So the research problem is defined as a definite or clear expression or statement about an area of concern that points to a need for meaningful understanding and deliberate investigation. So as mentioned earlier, you conduct your research because you have identified or recognized that a problem exists in a community or in the healthcare settings or wherever it may be. The research problem actually raises a flag that it needs to be solved. And so, by conducting your research, you're actually calling for a deliberate investigation about the subject matter to come up with a solution for the problem that you have identified. Now, this area of concern could either be a difficulty that needs to be eliminated, a condition to be improved upon, especially system that needs improvement in order for it to be more efficient and more effective, or maybe a troubling question that exists in scholarly articles. Now, a good research problem begins by introducing the broader area in which your research is centered, leading the reader to the more specific issues you are investigating. Now, as I have given an example earlier about heart attacks, so in presenting a research problem concerning heart attack, you actually start first, or you can actually start first by defining what heart attack is, what it does to the body, and then you can provide the risk factors as well as the causes of heart attacks, and then eventually to the specifics of heart attacks that you are wishing to identify or to solve. Okay, so that is a research problem. This is basically an inverted triangle to designate that a research problem, presentation of a research problem must start with a broader area, going down to the specifics of the issues that you want to deal with. And then research questions. These are refined statements of research objectives that detail the specific information to be provided by the research problem. So for example, these are refined statements. For example, your research question is, what is the socio-demographic characteristics of this certain population? Something like that. Those are research questions which you are aiming to answer by the end of your research study. Now, going back to the background of the study, again, it provides understanding of the problem being studied and reasons for conducting the study. It could be a general statement of fact that is related to the study, more specific statements about the problem by the researchers, or statements that indicate the need for further investigation. So as discussed earlier, in the background of the study, you provide a gist of this or the summary of the past researches that have been made similar to that of the research study that you wish to take. So in this manner, you're actually presenting the gaps and the weaknesses of those studies, and you can use those gaps as basis of what your research would be about, which would then give you a solid foundation about how your research will actually unfold. So in here, statements that indicate the need for further investigation. This is often provided in the recommendations area of previous researches, wherein they recommend to future researchers what areas need to be explored more or what questions could be answered in research studies similar to that of theirs. Okay, here, objective. It refers to the specific aspects of the phenomenon under study that the researcher desires to bring out at the end of the study. So objectives are basically the goals of your research study. It helps to define and limit the study scope because once you have set out the objectives or the targets of your research study, then everything that you will do must be related about to the research objectives that you have set in place. So it provides accurate description of the specific actions you will take in order to reach the aim. So other references actually describe objective as the road map for the study to keep it in focus. So by following the objectives, you do not cater the other extraneous things that might just be a nuisance to your study. Okay, characteristics of objectives. I have here a series of statements, and these are actually descriptions of a single word that actually describes an objective. So we have the options here below, and we could just match them to the table. So first is precisely what you mean to achieve. Precisely means specific. An objective must be specific. Okay. Second, indicate the relevance or importance of the study. Important, so therefore it must be important. Next, what you would do or measure in terms of studying an important or issue. So we're done with specific as well as important. And here is the keyword measure, so it should be measurable. And then the last, they should offer a solution to a problem. They should provide a solution to the problem, therefore an objective must be practical. Okay, so objectives must be specific. It should indicate precisely what you mean to achieve. It should be important. It should indicate the relevance or importance of the study. It should be measurable, meaning your objective must be measurable in terms of studying an issue. And then practical, they should offer a solution to the problem. Another characteristic of objective, vague objectives should be avoided. Any objective that is not practically achievable should be ignored. This means that objectives must be realistic. Again, the objectives that you have put to place must be something that you can achieve within the resources that you have and within the time frame that you are given. Next, researchers should be able to practice and perform as per stated objective. This is feasible, meaning it is doable. So again, researchers should be able to practice and perform the objective or the aims of the study as per stated objective. Next, these objectives set forth for study have to be such that they can be evaluated in different situations using tools for research. Then your objectives must be evaluable. Again, characteristics of objectives must be realistic. Vague objectives must be avoided, and any objective that is not practically achievable should be ignored. Objectives should also be feasible. Researchers should be able to practice and perform as per stated objective. Objectives should also be evaluable, meaning these objectives set forth for study have to be such that they can be evaluated in different situations using tools for research. Now, other references also describe objectives must be SMART. S stands for specific and measurable. A is attainable, or achievable, or realistic, or relevant, and T is time bound. Okay, objective should be SMART, it should be specific, It should be measurable, attainable or achievable, again with the given resources and time frame that you have. It should be realistic and it should be time-bound. Now would be the type of objectives. First, you have the overall statement or driving force of a study. Overall statement. This means that this refers to main or general objective. It states the main associations and relationship that you search for and to discover or establish the relationship. This basically states the main relationship of the variables that you wish to examine. Then second, specific aspects of the problem or issue that is to be investigated within the main framework of your study. Specific aspects of the problem or issue, this refers to the sub-objectives or specific objectives. Okay, this should be numerically listed. Wording should be clearly, completely, and specifically communicate the purpose and intention of the researcher. And each objective should contain only one facet of the study. So for example, in your study, your main or general objective is to determine if there is a relationship between the number of study hours as well as the exam score. So that is your main objective. You wish to determine if there is a relationship between those two variables of interest. And an example of a sub-objective under that main objective would be what is the level of knowledge for students studying for 3 hours. Another would be what is the level of knowledge for the students studying for 4 hours, or what is the level of knowledge for students studying for 5 hours. Those are just an example depending on what type of groups that you have for each of your respondents. So again, for the objectives, you have a main or general objective, which is the overall statement or what drives your study. And then the sub-objectives or specific objectives, these are the specific problems, aspects rather, of the problem or the issue that is being investigated. So your sub-objectives or specific objectives must use action-oriented word or verbs when writing objectives. Example is to determine. So you have to determine the number of study hours for students, to determine the exam scores of students studying for this specific number of hours. To compare, to verify, to calculate, to describe, to find out, as well as to establish. So these are just examples of the action words or the verbs that you can use when stating your specific objectives or your sub-objectives. Okay, so we are done with the details of chapter 1. Or the important elements of chapter 1, we have the research problem, the research questions, the background of the study, the objectives, as well as their characteristics, and the type of objectives. We have the main objective and then the specific objectives. Next is chapter 2, which is the review of related literature. Now, what is the function or what is the use of literature review? So it prevents you from duplicating work that has already been done before. So when you do a research, make sure that it is not a duplication or a repeat of a testing that has already been done by other researchers, because then that would only be a waste of time, a waste of resources to conduct a test on variables that have already been tested and whose relationships have already been established. So it increases your knowledge on the problem you want to study. So by doing a literature review, you're also gaining knowledge about or information about the phenomena of interest and how it has been examined by the previous studies, including the methodologies they have used, the statistical tests that they have used, as well as how they interpreted the results of those past studies. It gives you confidence why your particular research project is needed. Because again, by conducting a review of the related literature, you're also identifying the gaps and the weaknesses of those past researches, which would explain or support your present study as to why it is necessary to undergo another set of investigation of the similar phenomenon. So it could also be able or guide you to be familiar with different research methods that have been used by the past studies. Okay, and now would be the sources of literature. We have the primary, the secondary, and the tertiary literature. Now the primary literature, these are original study based on direct observation, statistical records, interviews, or experimental methods of actual practices or the actual data. So when you say primary literature, this is written or this is sourced from the person, he or the author, him or herself. So examples would be diaries. The diaries, these are basically stories about how your day went, so that is written by the owner of the diary himself, the accounts of how his or her day went. You have letters, photographs, and first-hand newspapers and magazine accounts. This may also include papers done by research papers because when you do a research study, you're actually gathering data. So these are primary sources of literature as well. Moving on to the secondary literature, this consists of interpretation and evaluation that are derived from or refer to the primary source literature. So meaning it examined the primary literature and then it made its own set of information about the data that it had gathered from the primary literature. And then we have the tertiary literature, which consists of a distillation and collection of primary and secondary sources, which includes textbooks, encyclopedia, articles, guidebooks, or handbooks. So examples of your secondary literatures would be criticisms, dictionaries, magazines, etc. So as long as the primary source of literature that has been examined is the primary literature, then the resulting product of that synthesis would be the secondary literature. And then tertiary would just basically be a combination of a synthesis of a secondary as well as primary literatures. Now we also have electronic sources of literature. We have the internet, the email communication, video recordings, audio recordings, as well as websites. Now these could either be primary, secondary, or tertiary, depending upon which type of information that you gather from these electronic sources. Okay, so we have arrived at another checkpoint. So determine whether the following sources are primary, secondary, or tertiary literature sources. So dictionaries. Dictionaries are, as mentioned, these are secondary literature sources. Next, we have diaries. These are first account events of an individual person, so this is primary literature. Third, we have textbooks. Now, textbooks could be secondary or tertiary literature, depending upon the sources that it actually utilized. Next are bibliographies, which would also be either tertiary or secondary literature. Next, encyclopedias. These are tertiary sources. And then autobiographies. This is primary. And then eyewitnesses, first-hand encounter. These are primary sources. Autobiographies, auto means self, diba? And speeches are primary. Okay, so we have here dictionaries, secondary literature, diaries are primary literature, textbooks could be secondary or tertiary literature, bibliographies, tertiary or secondary literature, encyclopedias, tertiary literature, autobiographies, eyewitnesses, and speeches are also examples of primary sources of literature. Now, this is an added notes for your lecture notes, so take a screenshot or a photo after all the elements are already placed in the slide. So, theoretical framework, it is defined as the foundational review of existing theories which will help you in developing and forming arguments in your work. So this is still part of chapter 2. In chapter 2, you have the review of related literature, review of related studies, theoretical framework, as well as the conceptual framework. Focusing first on the theoretical framework. So it is a foundational review of existing theories. So before you start a research paper, you have already identified your problem and you need to look for a theory that supports your problem or that supports your hypothesis. And these theories would actually be demonstrated by this theoretical framework that you will be presenting on the chapter 2 of your research paper. So use theories that support your research. So this would actually show using a theoretical framework or establishing a theoretical framework in your study would actually show that your assumptions or your predictions for your research study are actually grounded by theory. So it is therefore relevant and grounded in established ideas. So it basically, a theoretical framework justifies and contextualizes your research. Okay. So in presenting theoretical framework, it actually implies that your assumptions are grounded on some theory that is already established or accepted by the scientific community. Now, conceptual framework. Conceptual framework, on the other hand, illustrates the expected relationship between your variables and it defines relevant objectives for your research process. In a theoretical framework, this is just a framework or a chart about a theory to which the research is grounded upon. And conceptual framework, these are actually the variables in play in your research study. So we have here an independent variable causing an effect on a dependent variable. So you need to specify what is your independent variable here, and then your dependent variable. And then you have a moderating variable. So a moderating variable is actually defined as a variable that alters the effect that an independent variable has on the dependent variable. So alters the effect of independent variable. Effect of independent variable on dependent variable. That is a moderating variable. In other words, your moderator changed the effect component in a cause and effect relationship. Now in here, we also have a mediating variable. Now a mediating variable, this further explains the relationship between the two variables. So it basically is a link of the independent to the dependent variable, explaining further as to why the relationship of those two variables actually exist. So this is a conceptual framework, which is basically a flow chart of how one variable affects the other, or what are their assumed relationships. Next is Chapter 3, Methods and Procedures. So in Chapter 2, we have discussed about review of related literature and then the theoretical framework as well as the conceptual framework. Now in Chapter 3 would be Methods and Procedure. So more specifically, this chapter contains the overview of the research design, the study type, the ethical considerations, the variables, the sampling, techniques for data collection and pre-testing, plan for data processing analysis, and interpretation. So starting with the research design. So your research design is the blank structure within which research is conducted. So this is the conceptual structure within which the research is conducted. It constitutes the blank for the collection, measurement, and analysis of data. It constitutes the blueprint for the collection, measurement, and analysis of data. So in the same way as how blueprints guide construction workers in building an infrastructure, the research design also guides the researcher on how the research should be conducted. And it provides an outline of what the researcher is going to do. So again, your research design, it is the conceptual structure within which the research is conducted. The conceptual structure when the research is conducted, it constitutes the blueprint for the collection, measurement, and analysis of data. Research design basically guides all aspects from the data collection to the measurement up until the analysis and interpretation of data. And it provides an outline of what the researcher is going to do. Now here are parts of a research design. First deals with the methods of selecting items to be observed for the study. Selecting items. So this is sampling design. Okay. Second, it relates the condition under which the observations are to be made. So this is observational design or research environment. Which condition? Next deals with the analysis of gathered information of data. Emphasis on the analysis. So this is statistical design. And next deals with techniques by which the procedures are satisfied in sampling. So this is operational. Here is this one. Operational design. So again, the parts of a research design includes the sampling design, observational design, statistical design, and operational design. In sampling design, it provides the method of how you are going to choose your sample from the population of interest. Observational design relates to the condition under which the observations are to be made or the research environment. Statistical design, it deals with the analysis of gathered information of the data, whether you will use chi-square, ANOVA, etc. Or operational design, which deals with techniques by which the procedures are satisfied in sampling. Okay, study type. We have two. We have observational and interventional. So starting first with the observational. Observational means you just observe from afar, you don't make any interventions, or you do not participate on the group of samples. So you have descriptive design, which again basically aims to describe your phenomenon or variables of interest. Cross-sectional studies, which are one-time measurement of an opinion or variable or multiple variables in a population. And then we have correlational, which seeks to correlate one variable to another if indeed there is a relationship between these two variables. We have case control, wherein we first group the subjects into with disease or without the disease, and we eventually determine which risk factors occurs in a higher frequency in the cases, and we have cohort studies wherein the groups are exposed first and then eventually followed up for any changes in their characteristic. So again, in observational, you do not do any interventions or you do not manipulate the variables, you just observe them from afar. We have descriptive design, cross-sectional studies, correlational, case control, and cohort studies. For interventional, this involves quasi-experimental. This is basically like experimental studies, because in experimental, you're supposed to randomly assign your samples into groups prior manipulating the variables, but in quasi-experimental, the groups already exist in the population, and then it's only after then that you apply your intervention. And then true experimental, which involves random assignment of samples into groups prior application of your intervention or prior manipulating the variables. So again, interventional, we have quasi-experimental and experimental. These are the study types that we will be discussing one by one in the following slides. So starting first with the observational study types. This one describes the current status of a variable or phenomenon. Describe, so this is descriptive design. So, the researcher does not begin with a hypothesis, but typically develops one after the data is collected. Data collection is mostly observational in nature. So in descriptive design is different from most of the researches that we have done. Diba, we usually start with a hypothesis that we want to test, but in descriptive design, the researcher does not begin with a hypothesis. Most of the cases, hypotheses are actually developed after the study has been conducted, because during the conduct of a descriptive design study, they have discovered the nature of this particular problem, or they have discovered a new nature of the variables or so, which would then lead to the formation of a hypothesis, of a likely hypothesis by the end of the research study. And data collection is mostly observational in nature. In descriptive design, we just provide the readers with the descriptive statistics of the phenomenon, such as their frequency, their distribution, and something like that. Okay? So observational study types, we have number one, the descriptive design. Next, systematic collection and presentation of data to give a clear picture of a particular situation. This is cross-sectional studies. When you do a cross-sectional study, these are actually described as snapshot of the population. That's right here. Snapshot of a population. Okay, data is collected at a specific time. This is a one-time measurement of variables in the population, and it involves single or multiple variables. So it could either be qualitative or quantitative or mixed, and often questions that are being asked are like who is affected, like their age, their sex, or their other socio-demographic characteristics, where, when, opinions. So example of a cross-sectional study would be the socio-demographic profile or the socio-demographic characteristics of the August 2024 MTLE reviewees. So you just basically get a snapshot of their current socio-demographic characteristics or so. Okay, so this is cross-sectional studies. One time, specific time measurement of single or multiple variables. Here is another observational study type. It explores the relationship between variables using statistical analysis. Again, explores the relationship. So this is correlational. and it does not look here, it does not look for cause and effect, and therefore is also observational in terms of data collection. So if in your study you actually want to imply a cause and effect relationship between two or more variables, then your study design must be a causal study or an experimental study in order for you to have grounds to associate that one variable could actually cause a change in the other variable. In an observational study type such as correlational, you're just actually observing from afar and then you just gather the data all together and then you test them with either a Pearson's correlation coefficient or a Spearman-Rho correlation coefficient. So example, a study on the relationship between IQ and clinical depression. So here is your variable A and another is your variable B. So in a correlational, you just seek to establish a relationship between the two, but you do not seek to establish a causal relationship between IQ and clinical depression. So example, so if it is correlational, you would only be able to identify whether an increase in IQ is associated with decreased clinical depression, or would an increase in IQ would also be associated with an increase in clinical depression. But if you are going to do an experimental or interventional type of study, and then that's only by that time that you can actually claim as an IQ level causing an effect on the likelihood of an individual developing clinical depression. Okay, so again, in correlational, there are no interventions done by the researchers, so the values of the variables are only acquired through observation. Okay, so for the observational study types, we have discussed about descriptive design, we have cross-sectional studies, basically snapshot of a population, then we have correlational studies, and then moving on, we have here a group of people with a particular disease, which are referred to as the cases, are compared with a group of people without the disease, which are referred to as the control. So from the encircled words by themselves, this is the case control studies. Okay, so the purpose of comparison is to determine whether in the past the cases have been exposed either more or less often to a specific factor than the controls. So what it means is that the outcome of an intervention or outcome of a manipulation in a variable has already manifested at the present time. And your aim is to now identify which risk factors is actually has higher frequency rather in the case group rather than the control group. So to better understand what the paragraphs here mean, we have here an illustration. So at the onset of the study, which is the present time, you divide your population or your sample into cases and into controls. The cases, this actually have the disease. Cases are with the disease. Example would be lung cancer. And the control group would be those without the disease. These are basically healthy individual. Okay. So as you can see here in the chart or the visual representation, the case control study follows a retrospective design, which means the outcome is already manifested and you just wish to look back to which risk factors have actually contributed to the development of the outcome. Okay? So here again, we have already grouped the the respondents in the population into with disease, which example would be lung cancer, and without the disease would be the healthy individuals. And then you identify a risk factor of interest. For example, would be cigarette smoking. Okay, so focusing first on the cases, this one here. So you first assess which of the individuals within the case group is actually exposed to cigarette smoking or actually smoked. So we have here the exposed individuals. These are basically individuals who smoke. We have 4, and then we have unexposed individuals here, which only is 2. So the unexposed individuals are those individuals who have smoked cigarettes who did not smoke cigarette rather. So the unexposed group are the individuals who did not smoke cigarette but have developed lung cancer. And then the exposed groups are those individuals who did cigarette smoking and then eventually developed lung cancer. Now you also do the same with the samples inside the control group. So again, the control groups are healthy individuals. They are people without lung cancer. So still, the variable of interest is cigarette smoking. So you divide the controls into 2 groups, both the exposed and unexposed. So here, the exposed basically means individuals who smoked, but did not develop lung cancer. So again, these are individuals these are individuals who smoked but did not develop lung cancer. Whereas the unexposed group, these are individuals who did not smoke and did not develop lung cancer. So again, we have here the cases with lung cancer, the controls which are healthy individuals, and then with the variable of interest which is cigarette smoking, from the cases we identify those who have smoked. So we have 4 individuals who were exposed to cigarette smoking and have developed lung cancer, and we have 2 unexposed individuals who were not exposed to cigarette smoking but developed lung cancer. And then in the control group, which is a group of healthy people without lung cancer, we have here exposed and unexposed. The exposed individuals are those individuals who smoked cigarette but did not develop lung cancer, meaning they're healthy. And then for the unexposed group, these are individuals who did not smoke and also did not develop the disease. Okay, so that is the case control study. So in case control study, you actually calculate for the odds ratio. So the odds ratio represents the odds that an outcome will occur given a particular exposure, which is our case, the exposure was cigarette smoking, and then the odds of them developing lung cancer. So compared to the odds of the outcome occurring in the absence of that exposure. So here we have cases. These are with lung cancer. With lung cancer, the controls, these are without lung cancer. And then the exposed, these are those who smoked cigarette, and then unexposed is did not smoke cigarette. So your odds ratio is calculated using this formula, wherein A refers to the cases with lung cancer and have been exposed to cigarette smoking, and then C, which includes those still belonging to the cases but were unexposed to cigarette smoking. Everything is divided by controls who were exposed to cigarette smoking but did not develop lung cancer, divided by letter D, which is unexposed individuals, meaning they did not smoke and they also did not develop cancer. So that is the odds ratio, which will tell us about the likelihood of an outcome, or what are the odds of an individual to develop a certain disease after there's exposure on a certain factor. Okay, Next is another observational study type. These are people are identified and grouped with respect to whether or not they have been exposed to a specific factor. So this one is cohort studies. So it is basically the opposite of the case control study, because in case control the outcome is already manifested, and what you do is you do a retrospective approach. You examine which risk factor or variable the case has been exposed more compared to the control. This one, exposure actually happens first, and then you eventually follow up with the group to determine whether they have developed a certain condition. So the groups are followed up over time to determine whether the incidence of a particular disease is any greater or less in the exposed group than in the non-exposed group. So exposure comes first, and then again you follow up with the group to determine if they have developed a certain disease. Okay, so we have here a prospective cohort study. So you have here, this is a photo I took from, I think, Scriber. Okay, so again, we have here the researcher recruits healthy samples or cohort, and then you categorize them into either smoker or non-smoker. So again, you have here this population. You have the smoker, which are colored in blue, and then the non-smoker, which are colored in purple or pink. Yeah. And then you determine the risk factors leading to the outcome. So you follow up with the group whether they have developed a certain disease. So the individuals with a blue circle are actually no disease, actually do not have the disease, and those in the red circles actually have the disease. Okay, so that's basically cohort study. You wish to determine whether an exposure would actually lead to a certain disease. Okay, and then you examine the relative risk in a cohort study. So in the retrospective case control study, you examine the odds ratio. So what are the odds of an individual developing the disease if they were exposed to such risk factor? Whereas in a relative risk, you determine how much more likely it is for people exposed to a factor to develop a disease, because exposure comes first, and then you again follow up with the group whether they have developed the disease. So in here, the relative risk, we have here the formula. We have here A, which is basically individuals who develop the disease and were also exposed to the risk factor here, which is test positive. Okay, and then we have here individuals without the disease but was also exposed to the risk factor, the letter B. And then we have letter C, which are individuals with the disease but were not exposed to the risk factor, and then letter D, which are basically individuals without the disease who did not develop the disease, who were also not exposed to the risk factor. So that is relative risk. So it says, where are it here? Relative risk tells how likely to people who were not exposed. Okay. So the relative risk tells how more or less likely it is for people to develop a disease who were exposed to a factor compared to the people who were not exposed. Okay? Okay, so for the study type, we have already described or discussed descriptive design, cross-sectional studies. Descriptive design again basically describes the phenomenon of interest. Cross-sectional studies, which provides us with a snapshot or a one-time measurement of single or more variables in the population. Then we have correlational studies, which seeks to establish a relationship between one and the other variable. We have the case control, and we also have cohort. For case control, we initially divide the population into with the disease or not, and then eventually do a retrospective approach to determine which risk factor the cases were frequently exposed to compared to the control, whereas in the cohort, exposure comes first and then you follow up with the group after some time to determine if they have developed the disease or not. Okay, that's all for the observational study type. Now we move on to the interventional study type. We have quasi-experimental and experimental. So in experiment, first is it seeks to establish a cause and effect relationship between two or more variables. The researcher does not assign group and does not manipulate the independent variable. So this is a quasi-experimental research or design. So your aim of the research that you conducted is still to establish a relationship between one or more variable, but you do not assign the individuals into groups and you also do not manipulate the independent variable. The control groups are identified and exposed to the variables, and results are compared with results from groups not exposed to the variable. So an example of a quasi-experimental research would be a study on the effect of an after-school physical activity program on childhood obesity rates. So in a quasi-experimental research, again, you do not randomly assign the participants of the research into groups because the groupings already exists in the population. So an example of a grouping that exists in a school, the groups that exist in a school would be the grade levels. So the grade levels are already existed way before you conducted your research study. Okay, so example would be you compare the effect of after-school physical activity on childhood obesity rates on each of the grade level. You have the grade 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and so on, depending on your research. Okay? And then we have here the true experimentation. This is experimental research. So experimental research is true experimentation. It uses the scientific method to establish cause-effect relationship among a group of variables in a research study. So they make an effort to control all variables except the one being manipulated. So remember that in an experimental research, in order for you to be able to claim by the end of your research study that indeed variable A causes an effect or causes changes in variable B, you need to control all the other variables that may affect the relationship between those two variables in order for you to associate that indeed there is a cause and effect relationship because of just one variable that you have manipulated. So example would be diet plan. So diet plan on the insulin levels of diabetic patients. So you start with distributing the diabetic patients into several groups. So again, you have here a population of diabetic patients at a particular area, and then you distribute them into treatment plans. For example, would be diabetic patients distribute them to treatment 1, treatment 2, treatment 3, and then the control group. DP again is diabetic patients. And then to treatment 1, you implement diet plan A. To treatment 2, you implement diet plan B. And to treatment 3, you implement diet plan C. And in the control, it's either you keep them on their old diet plan or no diet plan at all, depending now on your research. Okay, so your dependent variable then, or your independent variable would be your diet plan. And then of all of these groups, you have your treatment group 1, 2, and 3. You determine its effect on the dependent variable, which is the insulin levels. Okay, so you have the diabetic patients as the diabetic patients. You distribute them, and these are the diet plans. Here, DP pa rin. These are diet plans A, B, and C, which is your independent variable, which is the variable that you manipulated or you changed on each of your treatment groups. And you have your insulin levels, which is the independent variable. Ay, sorry, dependent pala. Dependent variable. Again, your diet plans are your independent variable, and your insulin levels are your dependent variable. Your diet plans A, B, and C is your, you changed the composition of each of those diet plans for each of the treatment groups. And then, you must hold all other factors that may affect insulin levels in constant. Example, all of these diabetic patients across treatment group 1, treatment group 2, treatment group 3, and control, they must have the same exercise rate, they must have the same stress levels, or any other factors which may influence the insulin levels, in order for you that by the end of the study, the changes in insulin levels could only be attributed to the changes in the diet plan. Okay. So here's the example, study and effect of new diet plan on insulin levels on diabetics. Okay, another is interventional studies of the effect of a specific treatment on patients who already have a particular disease. These are clinical trials. So, patients who already have the disease are first determined if they fit the criteria for participating in a clinical trial, and then eventually would undergo the research study themselves. And then we have here interventional studies done at a community or facility level. So they test feasibility of new approaches at system level. These are community trials or community intervention studies. Community trials or community intervention studies. Okay, so community or facility level. So clinical trials are research studies that again, they involve human volunteers to test new existing treatments, interventions, or health conditions before these newly invented medications or interventions before they are being released for public use. And then community trials, these are experimental studies that are done on whole populations. These are used when exposure cannot be prevented among control group. Okay, so we have clinical trials and community trials or community intervention ethics. So in chapter 3, we have discussed about the research design. We started with the study types, the observational study types, particularly descriptive, cross-sectional, correlational, case-controlled, and cohort. And for the interventional, we have quasi-experimental and experimental. Then we have also the addition to interventional study types, the clinical trials, and the community trials. Now we move on to ethics. Okay, so ethics is done with research design and study. With research design, they are all part of chapter 3, and ethics is actually important for both the respondents and the researchers. So starting off with points on ethics for the respondents. So first is ethics to respect the confidentiality of the respondents. So when you gather data, especially sensitive information about your respondents, you're actually responsible for ensuring that these are kept confidential and away from public access. Okay, so second is participation must be voluntary. When you seek the participation of the respondents, you must emphasize that their participation is entirely voluntary, although we would want them to participate and to gather as much of the respondents as we can in our study. If they say no, then that is something that we must respect as researchers. You must emphasize during the asking for permission for the respondents, you must emphasize that they are allowed to say no, or even during the run of the research wherein they have already said yes to you in the first place, but then eventually they have decided to withdraw their participation. That is something that you must also respect. So participation must be voluntary. Next, respondents must be fully aware about the study and the possible risk, especially for researchers that actually do invasive procedures such as blood sample collection, tissue collection, or the other body fluid collection. You must fully explain to the respondents the possible risks of infection, of tissue damage, or nerve damage before letting them decide whether they want to participate or not. That is their right to be informed. Next is to do not harm the respondents, and respondents should not be paid for participation. They should, again, participate voluntarily. They should not be bribed into participating for your research study. Okay, but on number 5, you can actually just reimburse your respondents if they have travel expenses. That's the only payment that you can do for them for the reimbursements of their travel expenses. But for their participation, again, it must be voluntary. Next, points of ethics for the researchers. So that was the point of ethics for the respondents: to respect the confidentiality, to emphasize voluntary participation of the respondents, for the informed consent of the respondents, to not cause any harm to them, and to also not pay them for any participation. Okay, first we have here for the researcher, any conflict of interest between the researcher and the study being conducted must be declared. Conflict of interest. Conflict of interest may occur especially when, example, when a researcher is actually a shareholder of a pharmaceutical company and wishes to determine the efficacy of their own product. So that is actually a conflict of interest because that researcher is actually a shareholder of the pharmaceutical company that produces the drug. Next is make sure that the study is scientifically and methodologically sound. Integrity and data collection, analysis, interpretation, and reporting. So for item number 2, make sure that the study is scientifically and methodologically sound, especially again in researches wherein it involves collection of human samples. You must in the chapter 3, you must emphasize or you must elaborate the procedure, and then this will be reviewed by the ethics committee to determine whether the procedure that you will be doing is humane. Okay, 4, researchers should also not be paid for conducting a study, the same way as respondents should not be paid for participating in a study. Another is failure to act on or report adverse events of the intervention. All researchers involved in clinical or experimental trials must be a good clinical practice certified, because again, in clinical trials, this involves medical interventions which may be critical, especially to the patients. Next is authorship should be based on, first, substantial contributions to the consumption, design, or acquisition of data, and analysis and interpretation of data. So, as mentioned earlier in the title page of a research paper, the first name or the lead author that must be placed there must be that researcher who have contributed a lot in the data gathering, the formation of the research paper, etc. Next, drafting an article of revising it critically for important intellectual content, and final approval of the version to be published. So here are examples of studies that may require ethical approval. Any study with direct intervention, especially changes in medications or management plans or any invasive procedure, this requires ethical approval from a committee. We have taking any samples, we have sample would be blood, urine, other body fluids, tissue samples, etc. These are invasive procedures. Next, if there is any likelihood of causing physical or psychological harm. Psychological harm would be, example, you test the pain threshold, example, or physical or psychological pain threshold of an individual, so you let him or her undergo several stress tests, so that could actually impose physical or psychological trauma to the respondent. Respondents who may not be able to give informed consent, so examples of this would be mentally incapacitated individuals, or minors. Okay. Next, observation of people without their knowledge, all extraction and use of data from whatever source. If the research has any of this list here, if it involves any of the things that are listed here, then it would require ethical approval. Okay. Okay, so in chapter 3,